Good morning, communication ethicist, Dr. Sloan here. Welcome to COMM4100 Communication Ethics. This is week 1 of our class, and I'm going to post a video every week that includes pronunciations of some of the ethical frameworks that we'll be reading, as well as the ethical theorists. I thought it would be helpful to kind of introduce you to some of the language really briefly, and then I'll go ahead and pronounce things for week 1, although week 1 is, I feel really confident in your ability to repeat what you're reading accurately, as we'll see in just a second. So welcome to our course in Canvas. You'll see an overview of what is going on this week. Everything in red is an active link that will take you to that section of the class. And so if you have questions about what is expected of you or when assignments are due or anything, just shoot me an email and I'll try to answer as quickly as possible. So this week you'll have 3 chapters that we'll be reading from part 1 of our textbook. And by part 1, literally our textbook is broken into 5 parts. And part 1 is a way of grouping ethical frameworks. And we're going to call all of the chapters frameworks instead of ethical theories because for something to be a theory in terms of to meet the criteria of scientific theory, not all of these frameworks actually meet that kind of standard. So to be a theory, anything actually has to meet a certain standard, a certain criteria. So utilitarianism, for example, is an ethical theory. The way that Mary Holtz writes about Jesus and loving neighbors is actually a framework. So it's basically kind of her pick and choosing about Jesus's teaching and trying to think of one clear way of summarizing all that Jesus has taught and saying that loving neighbors is kind of the greatest principle. So that's a framework if that delineation helps. So the way that Christians and Merrill, and this was published in 2009, so Christians and Merrill 2009, the way that they are organizing the text is all of the week 1 is all of these theories are all of these frameworks, are altruistic frameworks. And so it's kind of like a stance as an umbrella, and under that umbrella are the frameworks that we'll be reading this week. You'll notice as we get further into the reading that some of the frameworks that we read in the text could be grouped in different sections. So, for example, a lot of what we'll be reading here at the end in terms of a communitarian stance fit really well with the altruistic stance as well. So you can kind of argue for certain frameworks to fit under one or more of the umbrellas, which we're using the word stance for the umbrella. So that's kind of some of the nitty-gritty technical language of how the authors, Christian and Merrill 2009, are organizing the text. So this week you'll be reading chapter 3, 5, and you get to pick a chapter from part 1 of the text, and then you'll also read a PDF about utilitarianism, so we can go to the reading page, and you can download that PDF here. So you have to read chapter 3, Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill, and you have to read chapter 5, which is Martin Luther King's Ethics of Personalism. And then you can choose to read chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 4, or chapter 6. As you can kind of glance and see, most of these are very easy to pronounce. It's later in the text that we will have more difficult authors or originating ethicists to pronounce. But just to kind of be consistent and posting videos every week, I'm going to go ahead and pronounce everything for you. So chapter 1 is written by Merrill 2009, and the topic is universal compassion. And the framework is basically Merrill trying to summarize the Dalai Lama's teachings and saying that on the whole, the Dalai Lama is presenting to the world that we should live in a way that is universally compassionate to all. The 14th Dalai Lama is named Tenzin Gyatso, and is a cool guy, and actually won, I believe, the Nobel Peace Prize in the late 80s. So a neat figure in history, and someone who has great thoughts to present about serving others. Chapter 2 is written by Mary Holst, so Holst 2009, and she writes about the figure Jesus from the Christian Bible, and presents his teaching to say, above all, that we should be about loving our neighbors, loving others. Chapter 3 is written by Cohen, Almagor, 2009, and the person being written about is John Stuart Mill. And so John Stuart Mill developed an ethical theory, or to be consistent, framework, but this one actually does meet that criteria, of utilitarianism, which is that everything has to have a utility or a purpose, and you'll kind of see how that fits with altruism as you'll read that chapter. That one's required, and you also read this PDF about utilitarianism to explain that concept. There are a couple of chapters in the textbook that if you talk to anyone out in the world about ethics, about ethical theories, whether it was studied in psychology and communication in whatever field, those are going to be theories that everyone has studied, and so utilitarian is one of those that everyone that's kind of had a foundational class in ethics has learned about John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. So that's why we have an extra reading about that one this week. Wilkins 2009 writes about Carol Gilligan's Ethics of Care, which is really a neat kind of feminist perspective on how maybe it's not just, we don't decide ethics based on logic all the time, but that maybe it's okay to be quote unquote feminine, and that women are often taught from a very early age to care, and that maybe there's an ethic in that we should accept instead of upholding logic as the primary way of making decisions about what is or is not ethical. It's kind of a neat perspective, and one that comes from a feminist research category. Chapter 5, written by Babcock 2009, is, so Babcock is basically kind of trying to summarize a lot of what Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about and wrote about. And in trying to summarize that, she summarizes his ethics by saying he's about personalism. And in every single class, we've kind of debated why Babcock chose to use the phrase personalism. My interpretation is that that above all, Martin Luther King is serving the God of Scripture, so Jesus Christ, who is a personal and loving God, and that everything that he's about in terms of civil justice is rooted in his Christian faith. So kind of the phrasing here doesn't necessarily come from King's writings, but Babcock's just kind of word choice here. And then chapter 6 is also based on another Christian figure, Mother Teresa. And if you know anything about her life, she really did live in the slums and just serve the impoverished and the overlooked. And so Hume 2009 writes about how of all of everything that Mother Teresa said, spoke, and how she lived, that her ethic is an ethic of sacrifice, that we give of ourselves for another. So part 1, everything is mostly easily pronounceable just from you reading and having a grasp of the English language. In future weeks, this video should be a bit more useful in learning to pronounce ethicist correctly, so that if you recorded a speech or spoke to someone about what you were learning in this class, you could speak articulately by pronouncing the theory and or the ethicist correctly. So anyway, I am looking forward to our discussion of communication and ethics as we move forward. Welcome to the class.